I spend a lot of my time pondering very, very important questions, things that really, really matter. And one question I always wonder is, will there ever be the next Beatles? Can there ever be a band that could have the same influence and impact on pop culture and music as the Beatles?
Short answer, I don't think the Beatles, there will ever be another Beatles. I don't think there will ever be another band that has the same kind of influence. Influence may not be the right word, but won't have the same impact in culture.
Why not?
As the Beatles. Well,
why?
I think a huge part of the reason the Beatles were as big as the Beatles were is that the pipeline for popular culture was really pretty narrow. There was, there were a handful of media outlets, a handful of radio stations, not a lot. It really kind of was just this very narrow. You had three or four BBC channels or whatever it was, and that was kind of it. That's all there was. And now we live in a day and age where the internet is anything you could ever want is out there. And you look at the ratings for TV today, and the number of people that are watching the number one rated show at the moment compared to any average show, a MASH episode or something like that. Yeah. The audience is there's massive disparity, and it's not that people aren't watching and people aren't consuming. There's just so many more options now. And at the time, really, the Beatles were kind of it. There were lots of other bands and things at the time that were going on.
But why the Beatles though? Even back then, when there was obviously other bands.
Well, the reality is that the Beatles were fucking fantastic.
Okay,
they're very good, but there are plenty of very good artists.
Okay,
there are lots of good artists now, but I don't think that it would be very, very hard. I mean, even the biggest artists of today, they reach millions of people, but they don't have the kind of the overall cultural impact that the Beatles did. Taylor Swift sells millions and millions and millions of albums, but I don't think that anyone's ever going to say Taylor Swift is the biggest rock star or was the biggest rock band of all time. There's no threat to the Beatles throne there.
I agree with everything you said. I can't have an argument with any of it. But I think if there would have been a point in time where there could have been a band that could have stepped up to the plate, it would have been the 80s when MTV was at its prime. Because from what I understand, in the 70s, it was all about the radio. A lot of the bands were faceless. So by design, a lot of the bands, they're all kind of the same. It was very, very hard for any band to reach out and become nominal. Unless you were already like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, the big bands that were already kind of established. But I really think, I agree with you. I mean, you come to, they say that like video games are more popular to the kids now than music.
Okay, but Pong will always be the first video game. Right?
Pong will always be the first video game.
And, the Beatles were always kind of the first big rock and roll band.
Okay, no, hold on. I'm gonna adjust your analogy.
Okay.
Yeah, Pong is the first video game, but the most popular one is Pac-Man. And I think that's what's probably more like I was. I mean, you have Elvis.
So you're saying Elvis is Pong?
Well, Elvis is Pong. Well, Chuck Berry or any of the original rock and roll stars. But when people think of video games,
right?
And I think that's what it comes to the Beatles. But anyway, going back to what I was saying, I honestly think if there would have been a band or an artist to take over, it should have been the 80s. When MTV, like that's me. I mean, like I specifically got into music because of MTV. And I really think if it wasn't for that channel, I don't know how much I would have gotten into music. I'm sure I would have bought a couple albums here and there.
For sure.
But, I mean, getting into MTV was like, here's these bands. You're seeing them, you're hearing them.
Right. Well, they're selling the lifestyle.
The lifestyle of whatever the band was.
Right. Well, I mean, there were bands that probably could have made a run at it in the 80s, right? I mean, you think Van Halen. Van Halen was huge for a while.
Okay.
The Beatles.
All right, well, let's go down that road. Is there any bands that you feel that could have been the next Beatles?
I mean, there were other bands that were huge.
I mean, there's the Stones, but the Stones are the Stones. You have Led Zeppelin, but Led Zeppelin's Led Zeppelin.
I think those are probably your closest analogies. I don't know that anyone else has ever come close.
I don't think so.
Like I said, by then, I think, rock and roll used to be kind of there was one,
I want, like, I'm a rock and roller. I'm a hard rock guy. would think there would be some hard rock band. I mean, a band that would come to my mind, like you said, Van Halen. Or I'd like to hit my mind. I mean, the obvious thing, the band I'd like to say is Guns N' Roses. But those are hard rock bands. And it's just like, I think they appeal to a lot of people, but I don't think...
They don't appeal to everybody.
They don't have that deep...
Across the board.
Deep meaning. The deepness that, like, a lot of the bands from the 60s and the early... The big bands have.
Yeah. Well, like I was saying...
I'm sorry, but
there weren't
Talk Dirty to Me doesn't...
weren't different styles. Rock and roll was rock and roll.
Talk Dirty to Me doesn't have a really deep meaning. In order for a band to be the next Beatles, there has to be this really deep emotional attachment. Okay, well, Nirvana. I mean, grunge. I mean, there was a lot of those bands. They're definitely talking about deep meaning, and could it be Nirvana? If there was, and I'm not comparing Nirvana to the Beatles, but if there would be any kind of a contender, because I'm trying to think of rock band
for the time frame, they would have been probably one of the best options if we're looking for the closest comparisons. But the reality is again, you're talking about a totally different day and age. I mean, the people who listened to Nirvana, but there were also other things going on at the same time, and probably a larger, section of the, when you think of the Beatles were pop music when they were recording, all the way through. Yep. They were the music of the day, whereas Nirvana was very much a section of the music listening audience.
Even though they were very popular, though.
They were incredibly popular, but by then your audience was bifurcated. There's the rockers, there's people that just listen to R&B, there's and there was just the metal guys. There was a whole different people had different places to go, different to get their music. And when the Beatles were putting music out, I mean, you had that, and you had George Jones. I mean, you had country music. There were not a lot of different ways to go.
If you were into rock and roll in the 60s, you were into the Beatles.
By default, yeah.
And you're right, because even as big as Nirvana was in the early 90s, it ain't like they you're right, because there's still going to be people that are into other genres of music, like metal or punk or alternative or college, whatever.
Right.
There's just I don't like these guys.
Yeah, and the reality is we're probably looking in the wrong place, because since the I would say the late 80s to early 90s, kind of the musical taste for the general populace has shifted away from rock and roll. In fact, rock and roll is barely a thing anymore.
That's true. I don't want to admit that fact.
But it's true.
But it is true.
It's true. When was the last time you saw? I mean, what was the last real rock and roll band to make any kind of impact?
I mean, there's rock and roll bands, but none that are like the White Stripes, I guess.
Maybe, but
and
you're still talking 20 years ago now.
Yeah, they're talking about early 2000s.
Yeah.
And the only reason why I even come up with that is because they were actually playing rock and roll that actually rocked. I never got the Strokes thing. I never got that. I never got into bands like Death Cab for Cutie or Modest Mouse. I mean, those bands became huge, but
Yeah, I mean, you still got things like Green Day, which kind of are still rock and roll-y-ish, and then, Weezer and things like that. But they also are bands that come from the 90s and
like
2000s.
Radiohead?
But again, also kind of still from that same time frame. When was the last time a new rock and roll band came out that had any kind of impact whatsoever?
Do you think this is because of a lack of talent?
I don't think it's a lack of talent. I think that the tastes have changed. I just, the culture has moved on. And it doesn't mean that there's not room for, rock and roll's gone through waves and waves and waves of changes and new. But it's been a while since we've seen one. It was like the last time we really did see any kind of, real change in rock and roll that was significant was probably grunge.
It was like I see that grunge is the last hurrah.
Yeah.
Of music that people really cared about, that it actually made a difference. I don't know. I mean, if there's any contender, and again, not comparing Nirvana to the Beatles, it could have been Nirvana, but their career was cut short.
For sure.
I mean, who knows? Like, say hypothetically, if they were a band and they did put out say here's their 6th album, and it's like, oh my god, I can't believe that they're making this incredible music.
Dave Grohl's gone on to make incredible music with Foo Fighters.
Yeah, but the Foo Fighters is not Nirvana.
But my point is that they had the talent. They had the ability. Obviously, Kurt Cobain was a savant when it came to writing catchy melodies and powerful music that people felt. Whether or not the lyrics made any sense, I don't think that was as big of a deal as the overall quality of the song. And he definitely had the ability to write a song people wanted to hear.
So when it comes down to the whole Beatles question, a lot of it comes down to timing and just the evolution of our technology and what we can do and what we have the options to do with our time.
I think so. I think that's a big part of it. Also, like I said, the Beatles, they were early on in the game. There was rock and roll beforehand, but it really was kind of they really were kind of at the forefront of rock and roll becoming mainstream.
As we're going through this, as we're brainstorming through this question, I mean, the answer, just as you said at the very, very beginning of this, is like, no. And at first that kind of bums me out. It's like, well, that's sort of like bad news or sad news. But then the more I think about it, it's just sort of like, well, maybe in some ways that just makes the Beatles that much more special.
That's true. Like I said, I don't think there ever will be another Beatles.
No.
And the thing is, I don't think the Beatles really, even today, have lost any of their cultural relevance. Nope. I think they're still massively important to who we are, and I don't think anyone's ever going to argue that.
Yeah, so Paul McCartney or Ringo Starr, if you're watching this video, if you think there's any bands that could potentially replace your influence and impact, put a comment in the section below.
Looking through a glass onion? Come on. I mean, there are a lot of Beatles drugs. Songs, or I Want to Hold Your Hand.
If you don't know, here's the rule of thumb, Joel. When it comes to the Beatles, if you don't know what they're talking about, they're probably talking about drugs.